Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
November had arrived at Hogwarts cold and grey, wrapping the ancient castle in a veil of fog that crept from the forbidden forest across the lake to the very windows of the towers. The trees shed their last leaves, which swirled in the wind like golden and crimson whirlwinds before settling upon the already frosted grass of the courtyard. The air carried the approach of winter, a sharp, barely noticeable note of frost that made students wrap their robes more tightly and hurry from class to class without lingering in the open corridors. For Hermione Granger, this November was not merely a change of season. It was a whirlwind of events spinning around her with maddening speed, leaving her less and less time even to breathe. The Triwizard Tournament had transformed Hogwarts into a place of constant tension and anticipation, and she felt this tension most of all, for Harry, her best friend, found himself at the very center of this dangerous game. Now, on a Sunday afternoon, when most students were enjoying their free time or preparing for the next day's trip to Hogsmeade, Hermione sat in the library at her favorite table by the window. The table, however, could hardly be called hers in the literal sense. It had long ceased to belong to her alone. Now it belonged to books. Books lay everywhere. They piled one atop another in precarious towers that swayed at the slightest movement of air. Open volumes occupied every free centimeter of the wooden surface, their pages fluttering from the drafts seeping through the old window frames. Fantastic Beasts, and Where to Find Them by Newt Scamander, lay beside A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration by Emmerich Switch. The Monster Book of Monsters neighbored A History of Magic, and atop it all towered a battered copy of the Standard Book of Spells Grade 4. Hermione sat in the middle of this literary chaos, and her bushy hair, which still refused all attempts at taming, resembled yet another unruly tower. She held a quill in her right hand. The ink at its tip had long since dried, and in her left she clutched an unrolled scroll, covered in her small, barely legible handwriting. Her eyes darted across the pages of Scamander's book, her lips silently whispering the words she read. The Hungarian Horntail, she whispered to herself, turning a page. One of the most dangerous breeds. Average length 15 meters, wingspan up to 20. Fire can reach distances of. She fell silent, grabbed another quill. This one, fortunately, was clean, dipped it in the inkwell, and quickly added several lines to the scroll. Then she set down the quill, snatched up another book, flipped through several pages, and once more plunged into reading. Around her, the library lived its quiet life. Near the far wall, a few Ravenclaw students argued softly about some complex magical paradox. Somewhere in the depths of the shelves came a slow rustling, Madame Pince, arranging returned books. At the neighboring table, 3 Hufflepuffs concentrated on writing an essay, occasionally whispering amongst themselves. And Hermione remained absorbed in her task. This was nothing new. Hermione had never been one to relax on weekends or put off homework until the last moment. But this year something had changed. Perhaps it was the responsibility she felt for Harry, who hadn't asked to participate in the tournament at all. Perhaps it was the desire to prove to herself that she could handle any workload. Or perhaps the habit of being the best had simply transformed into something more, a need from which she could no longer free herself. The clock on the wall struck 3. Hermione glanced at it, frowned, and returned to her books. She had to finish researching dragons for Harry. The first task was approaching, and he needed to know everything about these creatures. Then she had to complete an essay for History of Magic about the International Statute of Secrecy of the 17th century. Professor Binns expected it tomorrow. There was also a runes translation that Bathilda Bagshot had assigned for Tuesday. And Transfiguration, McGonagall had requested a detailed analysis of transforming inanimate objects into living ones, and Hermione wanted to write something truly impressive. She dipped the quill into the inkwell again, but suddenly her hand trembled, and several drops of ink fell onto the page of Fantastic Beasts. Hermione anxiously glanced at the book. It wasn't hers. It was a library book. and quickly blotted the stain with her sleeve. Fortunately, the ink hadn't had time to spread across the text. She blinked several times, feeling her eyes burning from fatigue. When had she last slept properly? Wednesday, it seemed. No, Thursday, or perhaps earlier. The recent nights had blurred into one endless marathon of reading, writing, and rereading. She fell asleep late, woke early, and between sleep and waking there were always books. Hermione. The voice startled her so that she jumped, and one of the book towers wobbled, nearly collapsing. Hermione managed to catch A History of Magic before it could fall to the floor. "Sorry," Lavender Brown said guiltily, standing beside her table. "Didn't mean to frighten you, just, are you coming to lunch? It's nearly 4, you know." Hermione blinked, glanced at the clock again. Indeed, 4 o'clock. How quickly time had flown. No thank you," she stammered, returning to her books. "I need to finish this research, and the essay. And you missed breakfast," Lavender reminded her gently. "Parvati said she didn't see you in the Great Hall this morning." "I had some toast here," Hermione replied, though this was untrue. She didn't actually remember if she'd eaten anything today. "Everything's fine, Lavender." "Thanks for your concern." Lavender hesitated a moment longer, but then nodded and left. Hermione heard her whisper something to Parvati along the lines of, "She's not eating again," but paid it no mind. Food could wait. Work could not. She took up the quill again, but at that moment, Harry and Ron approached her table. Both looked somewhat guilty, as if afraid to disturb her. "Hermione," Harry began carefully, "we're going for a walk down to the lake. Will you come with us? Just to rest a bit." Ron nodded, adding, "It's not bad today. Not as cold as yesterday. We could skip stones at the squid." Hermione looked at them, then at her books, then back at her friends. Some part of her wanted to agree, to go out into the fresh air, rest, talk about something other than studying. But another part, stronger and more insistent, whispered, "You don't have time. Harry needs this information about dragons. The essay won't write itself." "I can't," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "I still have a lot of work to do. Maybe later." Harry and Ron exchanged glances. Harry's look held concern, and Ron appeared somewhat confused. "Listen," Harry began carefully, "you've been doing nothing but work lately. Maybe you really should rest a bit?" "I'll rest when I'm finished," Hermione replied, already turning back to the book. "Don't worry about me. Everything's under control." Ron wanted to say something, but Harry touched his arm, and they left silently. Hermione heard Ron mutter something like, "She's going mad," but didn't react. She wasn't going mad. She was simply being responsible. The next several hours passed in the same rhythm. Hermione wrote, read, checked, wrote again. The sun slowly sank toward the horizon, flooding the library with golden light that eventually gave way to soft twilight glow. Madame Pince walked past her table, cast a glance at the mountain of books, and only shook her head, but said nothing. Hermione was a regular visitor, and the librarian had long since accepted her habit of transforming tables into book fortresses. When the clock struck 7, Hermione finally set down her quill. Her right hand ached from prolonged writing, and a dull fatigue pulsed behind her eyes. She looked at the results of her labor, 3 scrolls of information about dragons for Harry, an almost finished History of Magic essay, and a pile of notes for Transfiguration. Not bad, but not enough. She gathered the books, returning some to the shelves, taking the rest with her, and left the library. The corridors of Hogwarts were almost empty, with only the occasional student returning from dinner. Hermione walked quickly, clutching books under her arm, not noticing how the portraits on the walls cast her interested glances. In Gryffindor Tower she found the dormitory almost empty. Most students were still in the Great Hall or the Common Room. Hermione dropped the books onto her bed, sat down, and closed her eyes for a moment. Fatigue crashed over her in a heavy wave, and she suddenly wanted simply to lie down and sleep, not thinking about essays, research, or assignments. But she couldn't allow herself that. Hermione opened her eyes, pulled out one of the books, Transfiguration, and opened it to the needed page. 1 more hour, she thought. 1 more hour of work, and then she could go to sleep. She didn't know that this hour would stretch to 2, then 3, and that when she finally collapsed onto her pillow, deep night would already reign beyond the windows, and in her head, spells, dates, and magical theories would spin, mixed into one chaotic whirlwind. Monday morning began as always, with a bell that rang too early. Hermione woke with a heavy head, and the feeling that she hadn't slept at all. She lay for several seconds staring at the ceiling, trying to collect her thoughts, then rose abruptly. Today she had charms with Flitwick, and she couldn't be late. Dressing quickly and barely touching a comb to her hair, it, as always, resisted. Hermione grabbed her bag of books and ran down to the common room. Harry and Ron were already waiting for her, and both looked sleepy and not particularly happy about the prospect of a morning lesson. "Did you at least have breakfast?" Ron asked as they set off through the corridors toward the Great Hall. "Didn't have time," Hermione answered shortly, "but I'll grab something in class, or after." "Hermione," Harry began, but she interrupted him. "Please, don't start. I know you're worried, but I'm fine. There's just a lot of work right now, that's all." Harry fell silent, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. Hermione felt their glances upon her but tried not to pay attention. They didn't understand. They didn't feel the pressure that lay on her shoulders, the pressure to be the best, the smartest, the one who could always be relied upon. The Great Hall was filled with the usual morning commotion, the clinking of silverware, laughter, conversations. Hermione barely sat down at the Gryffindor table, grabbed a piece of toast, and immediately pulled out a Transfiguration book. Eating and reading simultaneously was inconvenient but possible, and she handled this task masterfully. "Are you seriously going to read during breakfast?" Ron asked in amazement. "I need to use time as efficiently as possible," Hermione replied without taking her eyes from the page. Ron only waved his hand helplessly. Harry said nothing, and they continued eating, occasionally casting her worried glances. Charms class began at 9 in the morning, and when Hermione entered Professor Flitwick's classroom with the other Gryffindors and Ravenclaws, she felt fatigue washing over her again. But she gathered her strength and sat in her usual seat in the front row. Professor Phileas Flitwick stood, as always, on a pile of books behind his lectern. He was so short that otherwise students simply wouldn't see him. His silvery hair was neatly combed, and his face bore its usual friendly smile. When everyone had settled, he waved his wand, and the door clicked shut. "Good morning!" His thin voice rang through the classroom. "Today, we'll continue studying defensive charms. Who can remind us what we discussed in the last lesson?" Hermione instantly raised her hand. This was a reflex, ingrained in every day of her studies. "Yes, Miss Granger," Flitwick smiled. "We talked about basic protective charms for personal belongings," Hermione answered. "Specifically, about the Colloportus spell for locking doors and Salvio Hexia for protection against minor hexes." "Absolutely correct." 5 points to Gryffindor. The professor nodded with satisfaction. "Today we'll move on to more complex everyday protective charms. These are spells that can prove useful to any witch or wizard in the most varied situations, from protecting one's home to creating a safe space while traveling." He turned to the board and there, written in chalky handwriting, several names appeared. Salvio Hexia, protection from hexes repello muggletum, repels muggles protego totalum. General protective barrier cave inimicum, warns of approaching enemies. These charms, Flitwick continued, are often used in combination to create multi-layered protection. They're not as powerful as some spells studied in defense against the dark arts, but they're much simpler to use, and don't require extraordinary magical strength. Hermione diligently recorded every word, her quill gliding quickly across the parchment. Beside her, Parvati Patil yawned, covering her mouth with her palm, and Lavender whispered quietly with Lisa Moon. But Hermione didn't get distracted. She was completely focused on the professor's words. Flitwick demonstrated each spell in turn. Salvio Hexia created a barely noticeable shimmer around the object, as if the air became denser. Repello Muggletum was interesting. It didn't create a physical barrier, but simply made muggles suddenly remember some urgent business and leave. Protego Totalum formed a semi-transparent golden dome, covering a large area. And Cave Inimicum was the most complex. It created no visible effect, but the caster felt a slight tingling on their skin, when someone with ill intent approached the protected zone. Students practiced for the rest of the lesson, and Hermione, despite her fatigue, performed each spell almost flawlessly. Her Salvio Hexia shimmered brighter than others, and her Protego Totalum held longer. Flitwick praised her several times, and she felt a small pride breaking through the fatigue. When the lesson ended, and students began gathering their things, Flitwick raised his wand, drawing attention. "Miss Granger, could you stay for a moment? I'd like to discuss something with you." Hermione blinked, surprised. She exchanged glances with Harry and Ron, who were already heading toward the door. "Wait for me in the corridor," she asked, and they nodded. When the last student had left, and the door closed, Professor Flitwick flew down from his pile of books and approached closer to Hermione. His face, usually cheerful and carefree, now looked serious. "Miss Granger," he began quietly, "I wanted to talk to you about something personal, if you don't mind." Hermione grew wary. "Of course, Professor. Is something wrong?" Flitwick smiled, but in the smile was a note of concern. "Not exactly wrong, but I've noticed lately that you look very tired. And not only I. Professor McGonagall has also noticed this. You work very hard, Miss Granger, even for you." Hermione felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't want the teachers to notice her fatigue, didn't want them to think she couldn't cope. I just want to be sure I'm keeping up with all assignments," she said carefully. "Everything's under control, Professor, honestly." Flitwick nodded, but the expression on his face didn't change. "I don't doubt your abilities, Miss Granger. You're one of the most talented students I've seen in all my years of teaching. But talent and knowledge don't replace rest. Our minds, like our bodies, need time to recover." Hermione pressed her lips together. She'd heard such words before, from Harry, from Ron, even from McGonagall, who after one transfiguration lesson had hinted that Hermione should sleep more. But she couldn't simply stop. Not now, when so much demanded her attention. "I understand your concern, Professor," she said, trying to sound confident. "And I truly appreciate it, but I can't reduce the workload right now. Harry has the tournament, and he needs help. And I can't let my grades slip. I just can't." Flitwick gazed at her for some time, and in his eyes she read understanding mixed with something else, perhaps sadness. "Very well," he finally said. "I won't insist. But allow me to propose something else." Hermione raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Something else?" "Yes. I'd like to give you a special additional assignment." The professor returned to his desk and pulled from a drawer an ancient scroll of parchment. It was unusual. Its edges were adorned with an intricate pattern resembling intertwined vines, and the parchment itself had a slightly yellowish tint, as if it were very old. Hermione involuntarily took a step closer, intrigued. "This assignment is on a topic few know about," Flitwick continued, carefully holding the scroll. "Self-preservation charms of awareness. It's an ancient branch of magic that combines elements of protective spells and internal understanding of one's own magical essence. A very interesting and complex topic." Hermione felt interest awakening in her, despite the fatigue. Something new. Something she hadn't yet read about. "Self-preservation charms of awareness," she repeated. "I've never heard of that." "Not many have." Flitwick smiled. "It's quite a rare field, and there's limited literature on it. But I believe it could prove useful to you in the future. Especially now, when there's so much uncertainty around." He extended the scroll to her, and Hermione carefully took it. The parchment was pleasant to the touch. Smooth, yet with a light texture that revealed its age. The pattern along the edges shimmered barely noticeably, as if some subtle magic were woven into it. "This scroll is special," Flitwick said, and his voice took on a more serious tone. "It has the property of helping achieve the best academic results. When you write your answer in it, it evaluates it. If the answer is correct, it remains. If not, it vanishes by morning." Hermione looked at the professor in surprise. "Vanishes?" "Yes. It's ancient magic embedded in the parchment itself," Flitwick explained. It helps students better understand material by forcing them to review and rework their answers. Naturally, this isn't a simple assignment. The question I'll ask you doesn't have an unambiguous answer in textbooks. You'll need to research, analyze, and think for yourself. Hermione gazed at the scroll in her hands, and something warm stirred in her chest. A challenge. A real intellectual challenge, not simple copying from textbooks. This was exactly what she wanted, something that would make her mind work at full capacity, something that would prove she was truly intelligent. "I accept," she said, and her voice sounded more confident than she felt. "What's the question?" Flitwick smiled. Now the smile was warmer, almost paternal. "The question is simple in form but complex in content." He paused, then slowly, clearly pronounced, "What is the fundamental nature of self-preservation, magic of awareness?" Hermione repeated the question to herself, contemplating it. Fundamental nature, not just a definition, not just examples, the very nature, the essence, the foundation. "Do I have a deadline?" she asked. 2 weeks, Flitwick replied. "But don't rush. This assignment wasn't created to test your speed, but to deepen your understanding of magic. Work on it at your own pace." 2 weeks. That was more than enough. Hermione was already imagining which books she'd need, which sections of the library she'd visit. An entire research strategy was spinning in her head. "Thank you, Professor," she said sincerely. "I'll do my very best." "I don't doubt it, Miss Granger," Flitwick replied gently. "But remember, sometimes best doesn't mean most. Sometimes best is what you can do without harming yourself." Hermione nodded, though she didn't quite understand what he meant. She pressed the scroll to her chest and left the classroom where Harry and Ron were waiting for her. "What did he want?" Harry asked immediately. "He gave me an additional assignment," Hermione answered, and in her voice sounded enthusiasm. "About self-preservation, charms of awareness. It's a very rare topic. There's almost no literature." "Another assignment," Ron interrupted, and in his voice was disbelief. "Hermione, you already have a mountain of work." "This is different," Hermione said. "This isn't just an essay, this is real research." Ron and Harry exchanged that special look which meant there's no point arguing with her, and they headed together to the next lesson. The rest of the day passed in the usual rhythm of classes. Transfiguration with McGonagall, potions with Snape, where Hermione lost 5 points for helping Neville, though the professor hadn't seen it, he simply suspected. And after lunch, history of magic with Professor Binns, during which half the class dozed off. Hermione tried to listen, take notes, but her thoughts kept returning to the scroll and the mysterious question. What is the fundamental nature of self-preservation, magic of awareness? The words spun in her head like a spell. She tried to break them into parts: protective magic, awareness, fundamental nature. Each word had weight, each hinted at something deeper. When lessons finally ended and students scattered to their affairs, Hermione didn't go to the library as usual. Instead, she climbed to Gryffindor Tower, past the common room where Harry and Ron were playing chess, and ascended to her dormitory. The girls' dormitory was empty. Parvati and Lavender were still somewhere walking, and the other girls weren't hurrying back to the room either. Hermione sat on her bed, opened the scroll on the small table by the window, and pulled out a quill and inkwell. Outside it was already growing dark. November twilight fell upon the castle quickly, transforming the sky into a deep violet color that gradually darkened to black. Cold air beat at the window, and Hermione pulled a blanket toward herself, wrapping herself in it. She examined the scroll closely. The pattern along the edges shimmered faintly in the candlelight standing on the table. The parchment was absolutely clean, untouched, and waited for her words. Hermione dipped the quill in the inkwell and froze over the scroll for a moment. Where to begin? How to answer such an all-encompassing question? She started with what she knew. With the basics. What is the fundamental nature of self-preservation, magic of awareness? She wrote the question at the very top of the scroll, in neat, even letters. Then, after a brief pause, she began writing her answer. Self-preservation, magic of awareness, in my opinion, is based on the fundamental principle of self-preservation, rooted in the deepest instincts of every witch and wizard. This is not merely a set of spells or techniques, It is an understanding of one's own magical essence and the ability to protect it from external threats. She paused, contemplating each sentence before writing it. The words flowed slowly, but confidently. According to Quirinus Quirrell in his work The Theory of Defensive Charms, all protective spells are based on the caster's intention to protect something valuable, whether personal safety, loved ones, or certain objects. This intention creates a magical resonance that forms a protective barrier. Hermione continued writing, referencing Miranda Goshawk and her Book of Spells, which described how different emotions affect the strength of protective magic. She mentioned how love and devotion can create the most powerful protective charms. But awareness adds an additional dimension, Hermione wrote, delving into the topic. This isn't merely an instinctive reaction to danger. It's a conscious understanding of one's own limits, weaknesses, and strengths. A witch or wizard who possesses self-preservation charms of awareness doesn't simply react to threat. They anticipate it, understand its nature, and build protection best suited for the specific situation. She continued writing, and the scroll magically unrolled beneath her quill, growing longer. Text covered the parchment line by line, and Hermione felt a certain picture forming in her head. She wrote about magical resonances, about the connection between consciousness and magic, about how awareness of one's own vulnerability could become a source of strength. When she finally set down her quill, her answer occupied a good foot of parchment, and the scroll had unrolled almost to the edge of the table. Hermione leaned back in her chair, feeling simultaneously satisfaction and exhaustion. Her hand ached from prolonged writing, and fatigue pulsed behind her eyes. She reread what she'd written. The text was logical, well-structured, contained references to authoritative sources. This was a solid academic answer, perhaps not perfect, but certainly good. Hermione felt a small pride. Of course, some aspects could be deepened, more examples added, but for a first attempt, this wasn't bad. She carefully rolled up the scroll, leaving it on the table. Outside, deep night already reigned, and the dormitory windows reflected only darkness and the rare fires of torches on the castle walls. The other girls had already returned to the room. Parvati and Lavender were whispering about something by their beds, and Lisa Moon was quietly reading a book by wandlight. Hermione quickly changed into her nightgown, climbed under the covers, and extinguished the candles. Fatigue crashed over her instantly, and she fell asleep almost immediately, not even managing to think about the next day. Morning came too quickly. Hermione woke to the light breaking through the gaps between the curtains. She lay motionless for several seconds, trying to understand why she felt such strange anxiety. Then she remembered the scroll. She sat up abruptly, throwing off the covers, and turned to the table by the window. The scroll lay where she'd left it, neatly rolled up. Hermione reached out, took it, and carefully unrolled it. The parchment was clean, absolutely clean. Not a trace of yesterday's text. Even the question she'd written at the very top had vanished. The scroll looked exactly as it had when Flitwick gave it to her, untouched, empty, with only the pattern along the edges. Hermione blinked, then looked at the parchment again, as if hoping the text would suddenly appear. But no, nothing. She turned the scroll over, checked the reverse side, also empty. Bewilderment changed to slight irritation. Flitwick had warned that the text would vanish if the answer was incorrect, but how could this be incorrect? She'd referenced authoritative sources, used logical arguments, structured her thoughts. What could be wrong? Hermione sat on the edge of her bed, holding the scroll in her hands, and frowned. Perhaps the answer wasn't deep enough. Maybe the professor expected something more specific, or conversely, more philosophical. She glanced at the clock. It was still early, almost an hour remained until breakfast. In the room, everyone was still sleeping, even Lavender, who usually woke first. Hermione stood, dressed quickly, and took the scroll with her. She needed to think, analyze, understand where she'd gone wrong, and the best place for reflection had always been the library. The castle corridors were still sleeping. Portraits dozed in their frames, only occasionally someone yawning or turning to the other side. Hermione walked quickly, clutching the scroll under her arm, and a plan was already spinning in her head. Which books to review, which sections to reread. She hadn't been wrong. She couldn't have been wrong. She just needed to try again, deeper, more thoroughly, and then everything would work out. At least, that's what she thought. The Hogwarts library greeted Hermione with its familiar scent of old paper, parchment, and the faint aroma of wax from candles that never fully extinguished. It was still early morning, and the great hall with its endless rows of shelves was drowning in half-darkness. The sun had only just begun to rise beyond the horizon, and its first rays barely touched the tall windows, creating long stripes of silvery light that cut through air filled with the dust of ages. Hermione walked between the shelves quickly, almost soundlessly, like a ghost. Her shoes barely touched the stone floor, and the only sound was the quiet rustle of her robes. She clutched the scroll so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. An empty scroll. Clean, as if she hadn't written anything at all. This was impossible. Simply impossible. Hermione stopped at the familiar table, the very one where she'd spent countless hours during her years at Hogwarts. The table stood in a cozy corner, surrounded by shelves of books about charms and spells. From here one could see the large window through which morning light fell, and Hermione had always loved this place for its peace and seclusion. She sank into the chair, unrolled the scroll before her, and gazed once more at the clean parchment. The pattern along the edges shimmered barely noticeably, as if taunting her. A special scroll, Flitwick had said, helps achieve the best academic results. But how could it help if it simply erased everything she wrote? Hermione took the quill she'd pulled from her bag and tapped it on the table, trying to collect her thoughts. Logic. She needed logic. If the answer had vanished, it meant it was incorrect. But wherein exactly lay the mistake? She began analyzing her previous answer from memory. She'd written about the instinct of self-preservation as the foundation of protective magic. This was logical. All living beings, magical or not, have a basic instinct to protect themselves. She'd referenced Quirrell and Goshawk. Both were recognized authorities. She'd mentioned the emotional component of protective magic, how a caster's intention forms the strength of the spell. All of this was correct. She knew it was correct. Then why had the text vanished? Perhaps the answer wasn't specific enough. Maybe the professor expected more detailed analysis precisely of awareness, as an element of protective magic. Hermione laid the scroll on the table and stood. She needed books. Many books. The next hour she spent wandering between shelves, pulling out volumes one after another. Advanced Theory of Defensive Charms, by Godric Wistby. Magic of Consciousness, by Delora Blishwick. Fundamentals of Self-Preservation in Wizardry, by an unknown 14th century author. Each book she brought to the table, and soon another wall of volumes grew around her. The sun rose higher, flooding the library with warm golden light. Students began appearing, first individually, then in small groups. Hermione barely noticed them. She was immersed in reading, her eyes darting across pages, fingers quickly turning sheets, lips silently repeating important fragments. Awareness in magic, she read in one of the books, is the ability of a witch or wizard to understand not only external threats, but also internal limitations. A witch or wizard who possesses true magical awareness knows the limits of their powers and doesn't attempt to exceed them without extreme necessity. Hermione paused on this fragment, reread it twice. Internal limitations. The limits of one's own powers. This was something new, something she hadn't written about in her first answer. She dipped her quill in the inkwell and began making notes on a separate sheet of parchment. Her handwriting, usually neat and legible, became somewhat more hurried. Words overlapped one another, lines went not quite straight. Time flew imperceptibly. Hermione didn't hear the bell announcing breakfast, didn't hear the students gradually dispersing to the great hall. She read, wrote, analyzed. Books piled around her, forming a small fortress of knowledge. Hermione. The voice made her flinch. She jerked her head up and saw Harry and Ron standing by her table. Both looked slightly guilty, as if afraid to distract her. "Oh, hello," Hermione stammered, blinking. Her eyes ached. She didn't remember when she'd last looked away from reading. "You missed breakfast," Harry said gently. "We brought you some food." Ron placed a roll wrapped in a napkin and an apple on the edge of the table. "Thanks." Hermione glanced at the food but didn't touch it. I was busy." "We noticed." Ron surveyed the mountain of books. "Is this all for that assignment from Flitwick?" "Yes." Hermione returned to her notes. "It's more complicated than I thought. I need to study the topic more deeply." Harry and Ron exchanged glances. Harry's look held concern, and Ron appeared somewhat confused. "Hermione," Harry began carefully, "maybe you should rest a bit. You look very tired." "I can't right now," she answered shortly without looking up from the book. "I have a really important assignment from Flitwick. It's a complex topic, and I need to understand it properly. Go without me." She heard Harry sigh but didn't look at him, heard their footsteps receding, and only then allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment. She knew they were worried, knew she was behaving strangely, but she couldn't stop. Not now, when so much remained unclear. The clock on the wall struck 12. Hermione pulled out the roll her friends had brought her and took a small bite without looking away from reading. The food was tasteless, or perhaps she simply couldn't focus on taste. She chewed mechanically, turning pages. In one of the books, Ancient Magic of Protection by some medieval author whose name had worn off the cover, she found mention of Emeric the Evil, a legendary wizard who lived in dark times and was famous for his protective spells. Emeric, Hermione read, claimed that true power of protection lies not in the might of charms but in the wizard's understanding of himself. He who knows his weaknesses can protect them. He who doesn't know has already lost without beginning the battle. Hermione froze, rereading the quote. This was deeper. This was closer to what she sought. Understanding oneself. Knowledge of one's own weaknesses. She quickly wrote down the quote, then continued searching. In another book, she found reference to Godric Gryffindor, not as a founder of a house, but as a master of protective magic. According to the text, Godric believed that the strongest protection comes from inner courage, from readiness to acknowledge one's fear and act anyway. Hermione wrote and wrote and wrote. Her notes grew to several sheets. The sun slowly rolled across the sky, flooding the library with light that changed from golden to white, then to soft orange. Students came and went. Madame Pince passed by Hermione's table several times, cast a glance at the mountain of books, and only shook her head. When the clock struck 4, Hermione finally felt ready. She had a pile of notes, quotes, references. Now she understood the question more deeply. Now she could write a truly good answer. She gathered all the books, returning some to shelves, taking the most important with her, and headed to Gryffindor Tower. She needed to copy everything cleanly, structure it, make the answer impeccable. In the evening, when silence settled in the dormitory and all the girls had gone to the common room or to dinner, Hermione sat at her table by the window. Outside it was already growing dark. November twilight fell quickly, transforming the sky into deep indigo. She lit several candles, unrolled the scroll, and took up her quill. This time she wrote more slowly, carefully choosing each word. Her new answer was deeper, more philosophical. She began with the premise that self-preservation magic of awareness wasn't simply a set of spells, but a holistic philosophy of understanding one's own magical nature. The fundamental nature of self-preservation magic of awareness lies in paradox, she wrote. To truly protect oneself, a witch or wizard must first acknowledge their vulnerability. Emeric the Evil claimed, "He who knows his weaknesses can protect them." This means that true power comes not from denying weakness, but from its awareness and acceptance. She wrote about Godric Gryffindor and his teaching about courage that's born from acknowledging fear. Wrote about how magical awareness allows a witch or wizard to anticipate threats, not because they see the future, but because they understand their own limits and know when approaching them. Then Hermione added reflections on the connection between inner peace and the strength of protection, about how a witch or wizard in harmony with their own magical nature could create a stronger barrier than one who relies only on the power of spells. The scroll unrolled beneath her quill, lengthening magically. Hermione wrote and wrote, losing track of time. Her answer already occupied more than a foot of parchment, and she still continued. She added historical examples, mentioned ancient protective rituals, about how different magical cultures understood the concept of self-defense. When she finally set down her quill, deep night already reigned beyond the window. Her hand ached more than yesterday, and fatigue pulsed in her temples. But Hermione felt this was a significantly better work than the first attempt. She reread what she'd written, corrected several minor errors, and finally, satisfied with the result, carefully rolled up the scroll. She fell asleep quickly, but sleep was restless. She dreamed of books crumbling into letters, scrolls unrolling into infinity, and Professor Flitwick's voice repeating, "Fundamental nature, fundamental nature." The next morning Hermione woke even earlier than yesterday. Barely opening her eyes, she immediately reached for the scroll. Her fingers touched the parchment, and her heart froze for a moment. She unrolled the scroll, hoping to see her text, her carefully written words. The parchment was empty. Once more, Hermione froze, staring at the clean scroll. 1 second, 2, then something inside her cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a thin thread breaking under pressure. She rose, clutching the scroll so tightly that the parchment crumpled in her hands. How could this be incorrect? She'd written for almost 3 hours, used the best sources, quoted legendary wizards, added philosophical reflections. What else was needed? Hermione dressed quickly, not even looking in the mirror, grabbed her bag, and almost ran from the dormitory. She needed the library, she needed answers. This day she didn't appear at breakfast or lunch. She sat in the library, surrounded by a new mountain of books, and read. Her eyes reddened from strain, her head ached, but she didn't stop. Harry and Ron came again tried to convince her to rest at least a little. This time Ron even joked, trying to make her laugh. "Hermione, it's you. You always know everything. Why worry so much?" But Hermione didn't laugh. She barely glanced at them and answered shortly, "Not now, please." They left, and she once more plunged into reading. She found a book about ancient runes and their connection to protective magic, found a treatise on magical resonances between caster and spell, even found an ancient text about meditative practices that helped mages achieve deeper understanding of their own essence. All of this she recorded, analyzed, structured. Her notes transformed into a chaotic mixture of quotes, thoughts, questions. Her handwriting became less legible, lines went crooked. In the evening, when the library was almost empty, Hermione finally rose. She took the most important books, there were more than she could comfortably carry, and headed to the tower. Her legs ached from long sitting, her back was numb, but she walked forward, clutching the books. In the dormitory she again sat at the table and unrolled the scroll. This time she decided to approach differently. Perhaps the problem was in structure, perhaps in insufficient concrete examples. She began writing for the 3rd time. This text was the longest. She detailed each aspect of self-preservation, magic of awareness, cited examples from history, quoted ancient authors. She wrote about the connection between runes and protective charms, about how ancient mages used meditation to strengthen their protections. The scroll unrolled and unrolled, lengthening beneath her quill. Hermione wrote until deep night, until her hand began trembling from fatigue. When she finally finished, her answer occupied almost 2 feet of parchment. She collapsed onto her bed without undressing and fell asleep instantly. The 3rd morning was the worst. Hermione woke with a cold feeling in her chest. She didn't even want to look at the scroll. Already knew what would be there, but still looked. Empty. This time she didn't feel surprised, didn't feel irritated, she simply felt something cold spreading inside. Panic. Real, open panic. 3 attempts. 3 completely different answers, and all incorrect. She sat on the bed, clutching the scroll, and for the first time in all this time, felt she didn't know what to do next. She'd read dozens of books, used the best sources, quoted the most famous wizards. What else could be done? Hermione slowly rose, hugged her knees, and simply sat like that for several minutes. In her head was emptiness, not from fatigue but from something else. From understanding that she'd reached the limit of her capabilities. But this understanding brought no relief. On the contrary, it spawned a new question that hammered in her consciousness like a bell. If all the sources available to her didn't contain the correct answer, then where was it? And then an idea came to her, an idea that made her heart beat faster and a cold feeling appear in her stomach. An idea she didn't want to think about, but which now seemed the only way out. The restricted section. Hermione had always known of its existence. Had even visited it before, in her 2nd year when searching for information about the basilisk. But then she'd had written permission from a professor. It was official, permitted. But now she had no permission. And she couldn't ask for one, because then she'd have to explain why she needed such rare, such specific sources. Would have to admit she couldn't cope with an ordinary assignment. But what if the answer really was there, in books to which students had no access? In ancient treatises preserving knowledge too complex or too dangerous for ordinary study? Hermione slowly rose from bed. The other girls were still sleeping. It was very early. The sky beyond the window was only beginning to lighten. She approached the window and looked at the Hogwarts grounds stretching below. Fog crept over the lake, wrapping the trees of the forbidden forest in a white veil. The castle slept, and only in the windows of a few towers glowed dim light. This was breaking the rules. A serious violation. Hermione Granger, who never, well, almost never, broke school rules for personal gain, was now seriously considering the possibility of breaking into the restricted section of the library at night. But this wasn't for personal gain, she tried to convince herself. This was an assignment from the professor. This was study. This was important. She knew it was a weak justification. Knew that in reality she simply couldn't accept that she couldn't cope. Couldn't accept that there existed a question to which she couldn't find an answer. Hermione returned to her bed, sat, and wrapped her arms around her knees. She needed a plan. If she really was going to do this, she had to think everything through carefully. First, the invisibility cloak. Without it she wouldn't even reach the library. Filch patrolled the corridors at night, and Mrs. Norris had a supernatural ability to sniff out students after curfew. But the cloak belonged to Harry, and she had to ask him to lend it to her. What should she say? How to explain? Second, spells. Alohomora for locks, if there were any. Lumos for light, but muted so as not to attract attention. Perhaps silencio on doors so they wouldn't creak. Muffliato if she had to speak or make any sounds. Third, timing. Safest to go after midnight when even Filch began dozing in his office, but no later than 3 in the morning. Then some teachers already woke. Hermione felt anxiety in her chest mixing with something else. With excitement? With fear? With desperation? She couldn't determine. The day passed in a fog. Hermione went to lessons. Couldn't miss another day, as it would raise too many questions, but absorbed nothing. In Transfiguration, Professor McGonagall asked her about something twice, and both times Hermione couldn't answer. In Potions, Snape acidly commented that even Miss Granger, it seems, is losing her wonderful abilities, when she confused the order of adding ingredients. Harry and Ron watched her with obvious concern all day. During lunch, Harry finally ventured. "Hermione, are you definitely all right? You look tired." "Everything's fine," she answered automatically, though it was an obvious untruth. "Maybe you should talk to Flitwick," Ron suggested. "Ask for more time on the assignment or something." "No," Hermione answered sharply. I've almost found the answer. Just need a bit more time." They exchanged glances but didn't insist. In the evening, when students gathered in the common room, Hermione carefully approached Harry. He sat by the fireplace with a book about dragons, preparing for the first task, which was to take place in a few days. "Harry," she began quietly, sitting beside him. "Can I ask you a favor?" He immediately set aside the book, turning to her. "Of course, anything." Hermione took a deep breath. "I need your invisibility cloak. For one night." Harry raised his eyebrows in surprise. Ron, who sat nearby at the chessboard, also turned. "The cloak? What for?" Harry asked. Hermione hesitated. She couldn't tell the truth, not the full truth, but she didn't want to lie to Harry either. "It's for the assignment from Flitwick," she said carefully. "I need to find certain information, and it might be in hard-to-reach places in the library." This was close enough to truth, though not quite. Harry gazed at her for several seconds, and in his green eyes she read concern. "Hermione, you're not going to do something dangerous?" "No," she quickly assured him. "Just the library, nothing more. I'll be careful." Ron frowned. "Hermione, this is just for some essay. Is it worth it, breaking the rules?" And here something inside Hermione snapped. She turned sharply to Ron. "And haven't I helped you break rules when it was necessary?" Her voice was sharper than she'd intended. "Haven't I gone with you into the Forbidden Forest in first year? Haven't I made Polyjuice Potion, which was more complex than half of what we're learning now? And all of that was for you, to help you." Ron flinched at the sharpness of her tone. Harry also looked taken aback. "Sorry." Hermione immediately felt guilty. I didn't mean to. It's just really important to me, please. Harry was silent, then slowly nodded. All right, but promise you'll be careful, and if anything goes wrong, come back immediately. I promise, Hermione said, and something in her chest eased slightly. Harry rose and returned several minutes later, with the cloak neatly folded. He handed it to Hermione, and she felt the familiar silky texture under her fingers. Thank you, she said sincerely. I truly appreciate this. That evening Hermione couldn't fall asleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and waiting. Waiting for the other girls to fall asleep. Waiting for the castle to plunge into silence. Waiting for the clock to strike midnight. When the 12th stroke rang somewhere in the depths of the castle, Hermione carefully rose. She was already dressed, hadn't undressed for the night so as not to waste time. She took her wand, the scroll, just in case she found something important and wanted to write it down immediately, and the invisibility cloak. Throwing the cloak over her shoulders, she felt the familiar sensation, as if her body were dissolving into air. She looked down, nothing. Only the floor, and her own shadow, barely visible in the moonlight. Hermione carefully descended the stairs to the common room. The fireplace still smoldered, casting a red reflection on the walls. The armchairs stood empty, and only the portrait of the fat lady quietly snored in her frame. She approached the exit and whispered the password. The portrait reluctantly opened, and Hermione slipped into the corridor. The castle at night was completely different from daytime. Shadows lay thicker, corners seemed darker, and sounds louder. Each of her steps, though muted by the cloak, seemed loud like thunder. Hermione walked slowly, carefully, listening to every sound. Portraits on the wall slept, or pretended to sleep. Occasionally, someone opened their eyes, looked at the empty corridor, and closed them again. Hermione tried to breathe quietly, move soundlessly. Somewhere ahead footsteps sounded, heavy, slow. Filch. Hermione froze by the wall, pressing against the cold stone. The footsteps approached, and behind them came quiet prowling. Mrs. Norris. Hermione held her breath, trying to merge with the wall. Filch passed by her without looking around. His face in the lamplight looked gloomy and focused. Mrs. Norris walked behind him, her yellow eyes scanning the corridor. For a moment it seemed the cat looked directly at Hermione, but then she ran on after her master. Hermione waited another minute, then carefully moved forward. Her heart beat so loudly that it seemed the whole castle must hear it. The library was very close now. One more turn, one more corridor. Finally, she saw the familiar doors. They were closed but not locked. Madame Pince never locked the library with a key, relying on students not daring to come here after curfew. Hermione carefully pushed the doors. They creaked. Quietly, but in the night silence, the sound seemed deafening. She froze, waiting to see if anyone would come. Silence. She slipped inside and quietly closed the doors behind her. The library at night was ominously beautiful. The moon shone through the tall windows, casting long stripes of silver light on the floor and shelves. Books seemed like black silhouettes, and shadows between shelves were thick, almost material. Hermione removed the cloak. Here, in the library, she felt safer. She took her wand and whispered, "Lumos." Soft white light flared at the tip of her wand, illuminating the space around her. Hermione headed into the depths of the library, there where behind a heavy red rope began the restricted section. The rope wasn't a lock, but it was a symbol, a boundary that students weren't supposed to cross. Hermione stopped before it, hesitating one last second, then stepped over. Books in the restricted section were different, older, darker, with covers that seemed made of strange materials. Some books hissed as she passed. Others stirred on shelves as if alive. One book even clicked something that resembled teeth. Hermione ignored all this, focusing on searching for the needed books. She had a list, names and titles she'd encountered in her research, but which she couldn't find in the ordinary part of the library. Treatise on Sacrificial Magic by Bartholomew the Deep Thinker. The Limits of Sorcery by Godfrey the Wise. The Essence of Protection by an unknown 14th century author. She found the first book on the top shelf, a thick volume in a dark green cover with gold embossing. She carefully took it down and opened it. The pages were yellow with age, and the text was written in ancient handwriting, difficult to read. Hermione sat right on the floor, directing her wand's light at the pages, and began to read. The book told of ancient magic based on the principle of sacrifice. About how a witch or wizard ready to give up the most precious could create protection surpassing any known spell. Hermione read about rituals, about symbols, about magical resonances between life and death. Time flew imperceptibly. She found the second book, The Limits of Sorcery, and read about how each witch and wizard has their own limits of magical power, and how understanding these limits is the key to true mastery. The third book, The Essence of Protection, was the oldest and most complex. The text was written, half in Latin, half in some ancient language Hermione could barely decipher. But she diligently wrote down everything she could understand on separate parchment. She was so deeply immersed in reading that she didn't hear the footsteps. "Who's there?" Madame Pince's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Hermione flinched so sharply she nearly dropped the book. Light from a lamp flickered somewhere between the shelves. The librarian was walking this way. Panic. Hermione grabbed the cloak, threw it over herself, and held her breath. The books. She hadn't had time to put the books back. They lay on the floor, open, clearly showing that someone had been here. "I know someone's here." Madame Pince's voice was sharp and angry. "Come out immediately." The light approached. Hermione backed deeper between the shelves, trying not to make any sound. Her heart beat so loudly it seemed it must burst from her chest. Madame Pince emerged from around the shelf corner and saw the books on the floor. She crouched, picked up one of them and frowned. "Restricted section," she muttered to herself. Someone was looking for something specific. She looked around, peering into the darkness between shelves. Hermione didn't breathe, trying to merge with shadow. And then, unexpectedly, somewhere in another part of the library, something fell loudly. The crash echoed through the empty hall, and Madame Pince jerked around. "What's that?" she exclaimed and hurried toward the sound, forgetting about the books. Hermione didn't waste time. As soon as the librarian disappeared around the corner, she quickly grabbed the books, tried to arrange them approximately as they'd lain on shelves. There was no time to do it perfectly, and rushed to the exit. She ran out of the restricted section, flew past tables and shelves of the main part of the library, and was already reaching for the door when she heard Madame Pince's voice behind her. "Stop!" But Hermione didn't stop. She burst into the corridor and ran. The cloak billowed behind her, not fully concealing her figure in motion. She heard footsteps behind. Madame Pince had emerged into the corridor. Hermione turned a corner, then another. Her breathing was heavy, her heart beat wildly. She saw the stairs leading to Gryffindor Tower, but suddenly heard another sound. Filch. He was coming from where she was heading. She had to turn and run the other way. Corridors flashed before her eyes. She used silencio on her steps to run more quietly. Used muffliato, creating a bubble of muted sound around herself. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, she found another route to Gryffindor Tower. Stairs, then more stairs, then a long corridor. The portrait of the fat lady shuddered when Hermione whispered the password, breathless and frightened. "Such a late hour, dear," the fat lady muttered sleepily, but still opened the passage. Hermione slipped inside, and only then allowed herself to stop. She leaned against the wall by the fireplace, which had almost died down, and tried to catch her breath. Her hands trembled, her legs barely held. But she'd made it. She'd read the needed books, made notes. Now she had information that wasn't in ordinary sources. Now she could write a truly perfect answer. Hermione climbed to the dormitory where everyone still slept. She sat at the table, unrolled the scroll and her notes. Her hands still trembled, but she took the quill and began to write. This time her answer was the deepest. She wrote about sacrificial magic as the highest form of protective awareness. about how a witch or wizard who understands the value of what they're protecting can create an impenetrable barrier. Wrote about the limits of one's own power and how accepting these limits actually makes a witch or wizard stronger. Used quotes from the ancient books she'd just read, added analysis of magical principles underlying protective awareness. She wrote until dawn, until the sky beyond the window began to pink. The scroll unrolled and unrolled, absorbing her words. When she finally finished, the answer occupied more than 3 feet of parchment. This was the longest, most complex text she'd ever written. Hermione set down her quill and looked at her work. She'd used everything. All her knowledge, all sources, all her logic and analytical abilities. If this answer didn't fit, then she simply didn't know what else could be done. She rolled up the scroll, placed it on the table, and finally allowed herself to lie on her bed. Fatigue was absolute, not just physical but something deeper. Fatigue in her soul, in her mind. But she'd done everything she could. Now all that remained was to wait. The 5th morning began, with the familiar cold in her chest. Hermione woke and for a moment simply lay staring at the ceiling. She didn't want to look at the scroll, didn't want to know, but, of course, looked. The scroll lay on the table, neatly rolled, exactly as she'd left it. Hermione reached out, took it, and slowly, as if afraid of what she'd see, unrolled it. Empty. Again, empty. Something inside her finally broke. Hermione lowered the scroll and simply sat, staring at the clean parchment. 5 attempts. 5 completely different, ever deeper and more complex answers. She'd used all sources available to her, both ordinary and forbidden. She'd broken rules, risked being caught, spent nights without sleep, and still, incorrect. She suddenly felt something rising in her throat. Not tears, she didn't cry, but something else. Despair? Desperation? Just emptiness. Hermione slowly rose, took the scroll, and left the dormitory. The other girls were still sleeping, and she was grateful for this, didn't want anyone to see her now. She didn't go to breakfast, didn't go to lessons, just walked the corridors of Hogwarts, having no certain purpose, holding the scroll in her hands. Today was the last day she had to submit the assignment to Professor Flitwick. And she had no answer. Hermione stopped by a window, overlooking the castle grounds. Outside was a gloomy November day. Grey clouds hung low, wind drove wet leaves across the ground. The lake looked leaden grey, cold and unwelcoming. She looked at the scroll in her hands. It appeared so ordinary, just old parchment with a pattern along the edges, but it had become a symbol of her defeat. Her first real academic failure, Hermione Granger, who always knew the answers, who always coped with assignments, who was the smartest in her year, couldn't answer one question. She closed her eyes, pressing the scroll to her chest. What would she tell Professor Flitwick? How would she confess that she couldn't cope? But she had to confess. There was no alternative. Hermione slowly opened her eyes, then looked out the window. Somewhere out there, in the castle, lessons were now going on. Life continued, despite her personal catastrophe. And she had to move forward too. Friday. The last day. Hermione woke to the quiet whispers of the other girls already gathering for breakfast. She lay motionless, staring at the canopy above her bed, and didn't want to move. Her body felt heavy, as if filled with lead, and in her head reigned a strange emptiness, not from fatigue but from something else. From the realization that today she'd have to admit defeat. "Hermione," she heard Parvati's voice. "Are you coming to breakfast?" Hermione slowly turned her head. Parvati stood by her own bed, already dressed, looking at her with concern. "Soon," Hermione croaked, and her voice sounded alien, hoarse. "Go without me." Parvati wanted to say something, but Lavender touched her arm, and they left the dormitory together, casting final worried glances at Hermione. When the door closed, Hermione finally forced herself to rise. Every movement came with difficulty. She approached the small mirror on the table and froze, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her appeared ill. Dark circles under her eyes were so pronounced, they looked as if drawn in ink. Her skin was paler than usual, lips slightly cracked. Hair, even more unruly and disheveled than always, stuck out in all directions as if she'd spent the night in a whirlwind. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep and strain. Hermione turned away from the mirror. She didn't want to see herself like this. She dressed slowly, mechanically. The robe seemed heavier than usual. She took her bag, placed the scroll inside, the empty, useless scroll, and left the dormitory. The common room was almost empty. Only a few younger students sat by the fireplace, playing at something. Hermione passed them without noticing their glances and exited through the portrait hole. The Hogwarts corridors were filled with morning bustle. Students hurried to breakfast or first lessons, laughing, talking, joking. Hermione walked among them like a ghost, quiet, unnoticed, lost in her own thoughts. She didn't go to the great hall for breakfast, couldn't eat, couldn't sit at the table, and pretend everything was fine. Instead, she slowly wandered the corridors, having no certain purpose, just walked, trying to gather strength for what she had to do after charms class. Confessed to Professor Flitwick that she couldn't cope. These words spun in her head like a curse. Couldn't cope. She, Hermione Granger, who always coped with everything, who always knew the answers, who was the best student in her year, couldn't cope with a simple assignment, though was it really simple? Hermione stopped by a window overlooking the courtyard. Outside was a grey, gloomy day, the sky overcast with clouds, wind driving the last leaves across the ground. The lake looked dark and restless. Perhaps the assignment really was extraordinarily difficult. Perhaps even the smartest student couldn't have found the right answer. But then why had Flitwick given it at all? Hermione pressed her palm to the cold window pane. Deep down she knew, this wasn't about the assignment's difficulty, this was about something else, about her. About how she'd worked to exhaustion, denying herself rest, joy, ordinary human needs. But she couldn't do otherwise. Didn't know how. The bell rang somewhere in the castle depths, announcing the start of lessons. Hermione sighed, and slowly headed to the charms classroom. Professor Flitwick's class was almost full when she entered. Harry and Ron were already sitting in their seats, and both turned sharply when they saw her. The expressions on their faces changed immediately. Surprise changed to shock, then to concern. Hermione knew she looked terrible, saw it in their eyes. She sat in her usual seat in the front row, took out parchment and quill, laid them on her desk. Her hands trembled slightly. She clasped them together, trying to stop the trembling. Hermione. Harry leaned toward her from behind his desk, and his voice was quiet but concerned. Are you all right? You look. Everything's fine, she answered automatically without turning. Just slept badly. Slept badly? Ron whispered incredulously. Hermione, you look like you haven't slept for a whole week. Hermione didn't answer. Couldn't. Because he was close to the truth. She really had barely slept these past days. Professor Flitwick entered the classroom, as always, energetic and smiling. He approached his lectern, climbed onto his usual pile of books, and clicked his wand. The door shut. Good morning, his thin voice rang through the class. Today we'll continue practicing the protective charms we've been studying this week. Who can remind us which ones exactly? Hermione didn't raise her hand. For the first time in all her years of study, when the professor asked a question, she didn't raise her hand. She simply sat, staring at her parchment, not seeing it. Miss Patil, Flitwick called on Padma, and she began listing the spells. The lesson passed as if in fog. Hermione heard the professor's voice, heard other students practicing charms, heard Ron's laughter when his Protego Totalum came out crooked and covered only half the protected zone. But all of this seemed distant, unimportant. She stared at the scroll lying in her bag at her feet. The empty scroll that had become a symbol of her failure. Time dragged sluggishly, but simultaneously flew too quickly. Hermione simultaneously wanted the lesson never to end, so she wouldn't have to go to Flitwick and confess, and for it to finish as quickly as possible, so all of this would finally be over. Excellent work today, Professor Flitwick smiled, looking at the class. Don't forget to practice these charms at home. Next lesson we'll move on to more complex variations. Students began gathering their things. The noise of conversations filled the classroom. Hermione slowly folded her parchment, It bore not a single note, had remained as clean as at the lesson's start, and placed it in her bag. "Miss Granger," she heard Flitwick's voice, and her heart froze. "Could you stay for a moment, the same as 2 weeks ago? The same as then, when it all began?" Hermione slowly nodded. Harry and Ron looked at her, not hurrying to leave. "We'll wait for you in the corridor," Harry said quietly, and in his green eyes such sincere concern showed that Hermione found it hard to breathe. She nodded, not trusting her own voice. When the last student left and the door closed, silence settled in the classroom. Professor Flitwick flew down from his pile of books and approached closer to Hermione's desk. His face was serious but not stern. Rather, caring. "Sit down, Miss Granger," he said gently, indicating a chair by the desk. "No need to stand." Hermione slowly sat. She placed her hands on her knees, clasping her fingers together so they wouldn't tremble. She set her bag by her feet. Flitwick looked at her for several seconds, and in his gaze she read many things: care, understanding, perhaps even sadness. "You look very tired," he finally said quietly. The last 2 weeks must have been difficult. Hermione wanted to say something confident, something like, "Everything's fine," or "I've just been working hard," but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, she simply slowly nodded. Her voice broke, and she forced herself to clear her throat and start again. "I didn't cope with the assignment, Professor." There, she'd said it, the words she'd been so afraid to utter. Flitwick didn't look surprised. He simply nodded, encouraging her to continue. Hermione took a deep breath. If she was going to confess, then, honestly. Completely honestly. "I tried," she continued, and her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "I really tried. I wrote the answer 5 times, each time differently, each time more deeply. I reread dozens of books, searched for information everywhere, in ordinary sources, in rare treatises even." She hesitated, then decided to tell the full truth. "Even in the restricted section," she finished quietly. "I know I wasn't supposed to do that. I know I broke the rules, but I thought there might be answers there that aren't in ordinary sources." Flitwick listened attentively without interrupting. The expression on his face didn't change. No anger, no condemnation, just quiet attention. "And what did you find there?" he asked gently. "Books about ancient magic," Hermione answered. "About sacrificial magic, about the limits of sorcery, about the essence of protection. I read everything I could find, used all this knowledge in my last answer. But..." Her voice broke again, and this time she couldn't continue immediately. Had to take several deep breaths before finding strength to speak further. "But every morning the scroll was empty," she whispered. "Every time. 5 times. I don't understand what I was doing wrong. I used all sources I could find. I thought about the question from every possible angle. I just don't know what else could have been done." Now, having finally said everything, Hermione felt a strange relief. As if the burden pressing on her chest these past days had become slightly lighter. She still didn't know the answer, still felt like a failure, but at least she no longer had to keep it inside. Flitwick was silent for some time, simply looking at her. Then, unexpectedly, his face lit up with a smile, warm, almost paternal. 50 points to Gryffindor," he said, and his voice was joyful. Hermione blinked, not understanding. She heard the words, but they made no sense. 50 points? For what? She'd just confessed she couldn't cope with the assignment, that she'd broken rules. I don't understand," she stammered. Flitwick moved closer and sat on the edge of the desk to be at eye level with her. His eyes were warm, full of understanding. "Miss Granger," he began gently, "you've just done the most difficult thing a person of your character can do. You came here and honestly confessed that you couldn't find the answer. You didn't try to hide it, didn't invent excuses, didn't blame others. You simply told the truth." Hermione still didn't understand. Why was this so important? "But I didn't complete the assignment," she whispered. "I failed." "No," Flitwick gently but firmly objected. "You didn't fail. You completed this assignment, and you completed it brilliantly." Hermione stared at him, unblinking. Her mind tried to understand, to make sense of these words, but they wouldn't form a logical picture. Flitwick sighed, and leaned back slightly. "Miss Granger, I must tell you something," he said. "Something that, I hope, will help you understand why I'm giving you these points." He paused, gathering his thoughts, then continued. "Lately, I and other teachers, especially Professor McGonagall, have noticed how you exhaust yourself. You've always been a diligent student, Miss Granger, the most diligent I've seen in many years. But this year something changed." He looked at her attentively, and Hermione involuntarily lowered her gaze. "You stopped sleeping normally, skipped meals, refused any rest. We saw how you fell asleep over books in the library, saw the dark circles under your eyes, saw how you became increasingly nervous, irritable." Hermione pressed her lips together. She hadn't known the teachers were watching her so closely. "Professor McGonagall spoke with you several times," Flitwick continued. "Gently hinted that you should slow down, take better care of yourself. But you didn't listen. You continued pushing yourself further, more and more, harder and harder." He paused, and when he continued, his voice became even gentler. "We understood that simple words wouldn't help, so we decided to arrange a lesson for you. A lesson you would remember, a lesson that we hope will change your attitude toward yourself." Something in Hermione's chest began to understand, even before Flitwick said the next words. "The scroll I gave you," the professor continued, "was enchanted with special magic. Ancient magic that the founders of Hogwarts used for teaching the most promising but most vulnerable students." He extended his hand, and Hermione automatically took the scroll from her bag, handed it to the professor. Flitwick unrolled the parchment, and his fingers barely touched the pattern along the edges. "This scroll had one simple property," he said quietly. "Any text written on it vanished forever, absolutely any. Not because the answer was incorrect, not because you lacked knowledge or understanding, but because the assignment from the very beginning was impossible to complete." The words hung in the air, and Hermione felt something inside her cracking, not painfully, but as if a wall she'd been building around herself for years was crumbling. "Impossible," she whispered. "Yes." Flitwick nodded. "The real task wasn't to find the right answer. It was to understand when to stop, when to acknowledge that a problem might be unsolvable, when to realize that the best solution isn't to fight to complete exhaustion, but to take a step back and care for yourself." Hermione sat motionless, trying to comprehend what she'd heard. All of this, 2 weeks of searching, sleepless nights, breaking rules, despair, all of this had been a lesson. "But you said this was research about self-preservation, charms of awareness," she stammered. "You said it was an important topic." "And I didn't lie," Flitwick gently interrupted. "It really is an important topic, perhaps the most important of all you can study. But self-preservation, charms of awareness aren't about magical spells, Miss Granger. They're about understanding your own limits. About the ability to recognize when you're approaching the point beyond which you can no longer function normally. About the wisdom to stop before you exhaust yourself completely." He looked at her attentively, and in his eyes deep care showed. "You wrote in your answers, I know because the scroll preserved impressions of your words, though it made them invisible to you, that true power of protection comes from understanding one's own weaknesses. That a witch or wizard who knows their limits can protect them. These were wise words, Miss Granger, but you didn't apply them to yourself." Hermione felt something hot rising in her throat. Not tears, she still didn't cry, but something else. Understanding. The pain of understanding. "The real test," Flitwick continued, "was whether you would come to me and tell the truth. Whether you could admit you couldn't cope, instead of continuing the struggle to complete exhaustion. Whether you value yourself enough to stop and ask for help." His expression softened further. "And you came. You confessed. You told the truth, even admitting you'd broken rules in the process of searching. This required more courage than any spell, more wisdom than all the books you read." Hermione sat quietly, looking at the scroll in the professor's hands. An impossible assignment. A lesson about how not everything has a solution. A lesson about how sometimes the wisest thing is to let go. "But," her voice was hoarse, "but why this way? Why couldn't you just tell me?" Flitwick sighed, and in his gaze, a shade of sadness appeared. Because people of your type, Miss Granger, perfectionists, overachievers, those used to always finding answers, don't listen when they're simply told. They must experience it themselves, must face impossibility, and feel what it's like to not cope, despite all efforts. He rose from the desk and approached the window, looking at the gloomy day outside. I've seen many talented witches and wizards in my life, he said quietly. Seen how some reached incredible heights. But I've also seen how others broke under their own expectations. Exhausted themselves to the point where they could no longer create magic. Some even... He didn't finish the sentence, but Hermione understood. Some even died. You're an extraordinarily talented witch, Miss Granger, Flitwick continued, turning back to her. Perhaps one of the most talented I've seen. But talent without wisdom is danger. Talent without understanding one's own limits is a path to self-destruction. He sat again, this time on a chair beside her, to be at eye level. I wanted to teach you not only charms and spells, he said gently. I wanted to teach you something far more important. That true wisdom isn't knowing answers to all questions. True wisdom is knowing which questions are worth your effort and which aren't. Knowing when struggle makes sense, and when it simply destroys you from within. Hermione looked at him, and something in her understanding of the world began to shift. All her life, she'd believed that success was hard work, that if you worked long enough, hard enough, you could achieve anything. That giving up was weakness. But Flitwick was talking about something else. About how sometimes stopping isn't weakness but strength. That understanding one's own limits isn't failure but wisdom. Hard work doesn't always lead to success, Miss Granger, the professor said as if reading her thoughts. Sometimes it only leads to exhaustion. Sometimes success is understanding when to let go. When to say, I've done everything I could, and that's enough. He looked at her with such warmth that Hermione felt something tightening in her chest. Let me tell you about one wizard, Flitwick continued. His name was Nicholas Flamel. You've probably heard of him. He created the Philosopher's Stone, achieved immortality, lived over 600 years. Hermione nodded. Of course she knew about Flamel, had read about him back in first year. Flamel was a brilliant alchemist, the professor continued. He spent most of his life searching for the stone, and when he finally found it, it seemed he'd achieved everything one could dream of. Immortality, endless time for research, the ability to learn everything that exists in this world. Flitwick paused, looking out the window. But do you know what he did a few years ago? He asked quietly. He asked Albus Dumbledore to destroy the stone, refused immortality, accepted that it was time to die. He turned back to Hermione. Why? Because he understood something very important. He understood that not everything we can achieve is worth achieving. That sometimes the greatest wisdom is knowing when enough is enough. That immortality, without understanding one's own limits, isn't a blessing, but a curse. Hermione sat quietly, contemplating his words. She thought about all those sleepless nights, about the walks with friends she'd refused, about the food she'd forgotten to eat, about the joy she'd denied herself because she had to work, and suddenly she saw it from another side, saw how she'd looked these past 2 weeks, saw the concern in Harry and Ron's eyes, saw Lavender and Parvati's worry, saw her reflection in the mirror this morning, exhausted, ill, unhappy. For what? For an assignment that was impossible from the start. No. For proving to herself that she could cope with everything, that she was smart enough, strong enough, good enough. But she'd always been good enough, didn't need to prove it to herself so cruelly. You wanted to teach me to stop? Hermione asked quietly, and in her voice understanding sounded. Flitwick smiled. I wanted to teach you more, Miss Granger. I wanted to teach you to value yourself as highly as you value knowledge. To teach you to understand that your health, your peace, your happiness, these aren't things that can be sacrificed for grades or academic achievements. To teach you that true magic of self-protection begins with awareness of your own worth. He extended his hand and carefully placed the scroll on the desk between them. This assignment had no right answer in the usual sense, he said. But it had a right action. And you performed it. You came to me. You confessed. You admitted you couldn't find the answer, instead of continuing to destroy yourself in the search. Hermione looked at the scroll. It lay there, innocent and simple, just a piece of parchment. But it had changed something in her, something fundamental. She began, but her voice broke. Had to clear her throat and start again. I always thought that if I didn't know the answer, it was my fault, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I needed to work more. And that's a wonderful quality, Flitwick said gently. Diligence, dedication to learning, that's wonderful. But when it becomes the only thing that defines your worth as a person, when you're ready to sacrifice everything else for it, then it's no longer virtue, it becomes a prison. He rose, and Hermione also automatically stood. Remember, Miss Granger, the professor said, and his voice was warm but serious. You're valuable not because you know all the answers. You're valuable because you are you. With all your knowledge, but also with all your limits. With your strengths, but also with your weaknesses. And the most important magic you can learn is the magic of accepting yourself as you are. Hermione felt something warm spreading in her chest. Not joy, not quite, rather, relief, understanding, acceptance. Thank you, Professor, she whispered, and her voice trembled, but not from despair, but from sincere gratitude. I don't know how else to say this, but thank you. Flitwick's face brightened once more. There's nothing to thank me for, Miss Granger. You earned this lesson, and I hope you'll remember it. Not only now, but in the future, when you again feel the temptation to push yourself beyond reasonable limits. Hermione nodded. She would remember. How could she forget? She glanced at the scroll still lying on the desk. Part of her wanted to take it with her, as a reminder, but another part knew she no longer needed it. She'd already learned the lesson. Leave it here, Flitwick said gently, noticing her glance. It's fulfilled its role. Now its place is here, in my office, not in your bag. Hermione nodded, and picked up her bag. It was lighter without the scroll, not physically, of course, but somehow differently. As if the burden she'd been carrying these past 2 weeks had finally been lifted. Go, Miss Granger, Professor Flitwick said. You have friends who, I'm certain, are very worried about you, and please, eat something. You look as though you haven't eaten for several days. Hermione smiled faintly, the first genuine smile in all this time. I promise, she said. She turned toward the door, but at the exit stopped and looked back. Professor, she called quietly. Yes, Flitwick turned to her. Did Professor McGonagall really know about this? About the lesson? Flitwick smiled, and in his eyes mischievous lights gleamed. Who do you think proposed this idea? He said gently. Professor McGonagall has known you longest of all of us. She knows how deeply the need to be the best sits in you. And she cares about you very much, Miss Granger. We all care. Hermione nodded, feeling something warm tightening in her throat. She didn't trust herself to speak more, so she simply nodded again and left the classroom. In the corridor, as promised, Harry and Ron waited for her. Both looked so concerned that Hermione felt guilty for all the worry she'd caused them. Well, Ron asked impatiently. What did he want? Are you in trouble? Hermione looked at them, at Harry with his sincere concern in green eyes, at Ron with his awkward but so warm care. At her best friends, whom she'd almost ignored these past 2 weeks. No, she said quietly, I'm not in trouble, quite the opposite. And suddenly, for the first time in all this terrible time, she smiled. A real, genuine smile. Come on, she said, taking them by the arms. I'm starving. And I need to tell you a very strange story. As they walked down the corridor toward the Great Hall, Hermione felt something had changed. Not in the castle, not in the surrounding world. In herself. She was still Hermione Granger. Still loved learning, still sought knowledge. But now she knew something new. Something important. That sometimes the wisest decision isn't to find the answer, but to admit it might not exist. That true strength isn't never falling, but having the courage to rise and ask for help. That she's valuable not for her grades but for who she is. And that caring for herself isn't weakness, it's the strongest magic of all. A week had passed. November gradually transitioned into December, and Hogwarts prepared for winter. The first snow had already fallen. Light as powder, it covered the roofs of towers and the courtyard with a thin white layer. The lake hadn't yet frozen, but its edge was already covered with thin ice that glistened in the sun when it occasionally broke through the clouds. Hermione sat in the library at her usual table by the window. Before her lay books, Transfiguration, Theory and Practice, A History of the Goblin Rebellions, several volumes about charms. She was writing an essay for Professor McGonagall, and her quill glided evenly across the parchment. But something had changed. Around her, no towers of books piled up. On the table didn't lie dozens of open volumes. She worked with concentration but calmly, without that feverish tension that had accompanied her recent months. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. Her face had regained its healthy color. Her hair, though still as unruly, looked clean and cared for. She even smiled from time to time, reading something interesting in a book. Hermione, she raised her head and saw Harry and Ron walking between the shelves toward her table. Both were dressed in warm robes and scarves, obviously preparing to go somewhere outside. "We're going for a walk to Hogsmeade," Harry said, stopping by her table. "Want to come with us? The Three Broomsticks has a new hot butterbeer with cinnamon." A month ago, even a week ago, Hermione would have automatically refused. Would have said she had to finish the essay, that she didn't have time, that they should go without her. But now she looked at her parchment. The essay was half finished, and she was making good progress. Then at her friends, and smiled. "Of course," she said, setting down her quill. "The essay can wait. I still have until Monday." Harry and Ron exchanged glances, and in their eyes flashed surprise, mixed with joy. "Really?" Ron didn't believe it. "You're really abandoning work for a walk?" Hermione laughed, lightly, genuinely. "Not abandoning," she corrected, "just taking a break. They're different things." She neatly folded the parchment, closed the books, and placed them in her bag. Her movements were calm, unhurried. She no longer rushed, no longer fretted, no longer felt that burden of guilt for every minute spent not studying. They left the library together, and Hermione felt how pleasant it was simply to walk beside friends, talk about trifles, laugh at Ron's jokes. Life, it turned out, consisted not only of books and essays, it consisted of such moments too, simple, warm, human. That same evening when they returned from Hogsmeade, rosy from the frost, satisfied and happy, Hermione climbed to Gryffindor dormitory. In the common room by the fireplace sat Neville Longbottom, bent over a herbology textbook. His face was concentrated but slightly confused. "Problems?" Hermione asked gently, approaching him. Neville flinched and looked at her. "Oh, hello, Hermione," he stammered. "Just can't understand this assignment from Professor Sprout. About the magical properties of mandrakes. It says here about applications in potions, but I don't understand why exactly these properties make it useful." A month ago, Hermione would have immediately taken his textbook and explained everything from beginning to end. Or even written part of the essay for him, convincing herself she was simply helping. But now she sat beside him, glanced at the textbook, and smiled. "Look at this paragraph," she said, pointing to the needed place. "It mentions restorative properties. Now remember what mandrakes do in potions we studied in second year." Neville frowned, thinking, They return people to normal state after transfiguration or curses." "Exactly," Hermione nodded approvingly. "Now think, why exactly are these properties important?" Neville pondered, and Hermione saw fragments of knowledge beginning to connect in his head. "Because it doesn't just heal," he said slowly. "It restores the initial state, returns everything to how it was before." "Precisely," Hermione smiled. "You can understand this yourself, Neville. I believe in you. Just don't rush. Think about the connections." Neville looked at her in surprise. He probably expected her to take his work and do everything herself, but then a smile appeared on his face. "Thank you, Hermione," he said sincerely. I'll try myself." She nodded and went to her dormitory, feeling a strange satisfaction. Helping someone learn was better than simply doing work for them. It gave them a chance to grow, rather than remain dependent. The next evening, in the common room, reigned a special atmosphere. Soon the Yule Ball was to take place. the first major event connected with the Triwizard Tournament, and the girls gathered together, discussing dresses, hairstyles, and partners for dancing. Hermione sat in an armchair by the fireplace with a book, but wasn't reading. Instead, she listened to conversations around her. Parvati and Lavender argued about which ornaments better suited their dresses, and Ginny Weasley told something about new shoes. Hermione, Lavender suddenly turned to her. Have you decided yet how you'll do your hair for the ball? A month ago this question would have caused Hermione panic. She would have started fretting, thinking she wasn't managing to prepare, that she had so much other work, but now she simply smiled. Not yet, she answered calmly. But I have a few ideas. Maybe I'll try something with plaits. Oh, that'll be wonderful, Parvati rejoiced. Want me to help? I can do French plaits. I'd love to, Hermione nodded, and it was true. She really looked forward to the ball, not as another obligation, not as another item on her to-do list, but simply as a pleasant event to be enjoyed. Later, when most students had already gone to sleep, only Hermione and Harry remained by the fireplace. He sat opposite her, staring into the fire, and his face was thoughtful. Thank you, he said unexpectedly, quietly. Hermione looked at him in surprise. For what? For all the help with the tournament, Harry answered. For the research about dragons. For advice, for support. I know you spent a lot of time on this. Hermione smiled. Of course, you're my friend. Harry nodded but continued looking at her with curiosity. You've changed, he finally said. Over the last week. Become somehow calmer. What happened? Hermione fell silent, contemplating her answer. How to explain what she herself hadn't yet fully comprehended. How to tell about a lesson that was simultaneously simple and profound. Flitwick taught me an important lesson, she finally said gently, looking into the fire. About how you don't always have to have an answer to everything. About how sometimes the wisest thing is to stop and take care of yourself. Harry gazed at her, and in his eyes, understanding showed. That's a good lesson, he said quietly. Yes, Hermione agreed. A very good one. They were silent for some time, simply sitting in the warmth of the fireplace, and Hermione felt deep peace. She was still herself. Still loved learning. Still sought knowledge. But now she knew there were things more important than grades and essays. Friendship, health, joy, life. Sunday dawn found Hermione in the library, not because she had to be there, but because she wanted to. She'd finished all her assignments for the week and now simply read for pleasure, an interesting book about the history of protective charms she'd found by chance. The library was almost empty. Beyond the windows light snow fell, large flakes slowly descending to earth, covering everything around with a white blanket. The lake had now frozen completely, and its surface gleamed like a mirror. Hermione sat in her favorite place by the window. On her lap lay an open book, but she wasn't reading. Instead, she simply looked out the window, watching how snow fell on the roofs of Hogwarts, how it decorated the towers with white caps, how it transformed the old castle into a fairy tale picture. She smiled. Quietly, peacefully, happily. Once, it seemed very long ago, though only a month had passed, she'd sat here, surrounded by mountains of books, exhausted and unhappy, convinced she had to find the answer to an impossible question. Convinced her worth was determined by how much she knew, how much she worked, how flawless her essays were. Now she knew differently. Ahead were still exams. Of course there were. There were essays, homework, research. There was the tournament in which Harry would have to pass 2 more tasks. There were adventures, dangers, trials, all that Hogwarts was always filled with. But now, Hermione Granger knew something very important. She knew that sometimes the strongest magic lies not in the spells you know, not in the books you've read, not in the grades you've received. The strongest magic is understanding when to stop. It's being able to value yourself, not only your achievements. It's knowing your limits and not being afraid to acknowledge them. It's having the courage sometimes to let go and simply live. Hermione looked at the snow falling beyond the window and smiled. The book on her lap remained unopened, but that was nothing. She'd read it later. Or not read it, and that was all right too. Because right now, in this moment, the most important thing was simply to sit here by the window, watch the beauty of winter Hogwarts, and feel peace. And that was the best magic of all.